Episode 1, Blood in the Snow, Part 1. The wind moved low across the Alaskan tundra, dragging loose snow in thin white veils across the frozen ground, reshaping tracks, swallowing sound, erasing evidence of everything that dared to exist out here. And Caleb Mercer stood still among the black spruce trees, with the patience of a man who had once waited in darker places than this. Rifle steady against his shoulder, breath slow and controlled despite the knife-edged cold that cut through layered wool and canvas. He had been watching the clearing for nearly 40 minutes, knowing the sow would return because mothers always returned, because hunger always won over caution, because instinct was predictable if you studied it long enough. And Caleb had built his life on studying patterns, on calculating risk, on understanding that the wild was not chaos, but mathematics, written in blood and snow. Below him, the carcass of a moose calf lay stiff and partially buried where he had dragged it 2 nights earlier. A bait, heavy with scent, that traveled for miles in this air so clean it almost felt sterile. And when the first dark shape emerged between the trees, he did not smile, did not shift, did not feel triumph. He simply adjusted the angle of the rifle and watched through the scope as the massive brown form stepped cautiously into view. Fur thick with frost, head low, nostrils flaring, eyes scanning the tree line with an intelligence that irritated him because it suggested awareness. And awareness made killing feel less mechanical. Behind her, 2 smaller shapes stumbled into the open. Cubs born last spring, still awkward in their growth, their fur lighter, their movements unsteady but curious, unaware of how the world balanced itself. Caleb exhaled slowly and let the crosshairs settle just behind the sow's shoulder, where heart and lung aligned, remembering the first time he had been taught to shoot for efficiency rather than drama, remembering the voice of an instructor who had said hesitation was cruelty, and he squeezed the trigger with the same disciplined pressure he had used years ago in another uniform, the rifle cracking through the silence like a fracture in the sky, recoil firm but familiar, and the sow dropped forward into the snow with a heavy thud that sent the cubs scattering in confusion rather than immediate flight. The second shot came faster, instinctive, striking one of the cubs before it fully understood the shape of death, and the clearing filled with the metallic scent of blood blooming hot against white, steam rising from wounds that stained the snow in violent contrast. The surviving cub bolted toward the tree line, small legs punching desperately through powder. And for a fraction of a second, Caleb tracked it through the scope, calculating distance, wind, ammunition. But he did not fire because it was already half hidden in brush, and the angle was poor and wasted. Bullets annoyed him more than unfinished work. Instead, he lowered the rifle and began the slow descent toward the clearing. Boots crunching with deliberate rhythm, eyes scanning for movement. Because wounded animals sometimes rose and mothers sometimes surprised even the most confident hunter. But the sow lay still, her breath already gone, her body immense and heavy and worth money. Caleb moved without ceremony, checking the cub he had shot to ensure there would be no unnecessary suffering, then circling the sow to assess entry and exit wounds with a butcher's practicality, noting pelt quality, thickness, damage, thinking ahead to buyers in small coastal towns who asked no questions as long as the fur was clean and the price fair. He worked with methodical efficiency, knife flashing in the pale light as he began the long process of skinning, hands reddening despite gloves, breath-forming clouds that drifted upward into a sky already turning the color of iron, as afternoon began its slow descent toward Arctic dusk. And though he did not look toward the trees where the surviving cub had vanished, he was aware of that direction as one is aware of a draft in a closed room. Somewhere beyond the immediate circle of his work, branches shifted once and then stilled, and Caleb paused only long enough to listen, head tilted slightly, senses extended, but the forest returned to its heavy quiet, and he resumed cutting, separating hide from flesh with practice strokes, rolling the pelt carefully to preserve value, telling himself that leaving one cub alive meant nothing in a land where winter claimed more than rifles ever could. By the time the first true shadows stretched across the clearing, he had secured the hides, marked coordinates in a small waterproof notebook, and dragged what remained of the carcasses into a position less visible from the air. Not out of respect, but out of caution, because patrol planes sometimes passed farther south, and though this territory lay beyond most official routes, he trusted nothing he could not see. He hoisted the bundled pelts onto his sled and began the trek back toward his cabin miles away through terrain. He knew intimately, moving with the confidence of someone who believed the forest was a map already memorized, unaware that far behind him, half hidden between black trunks and drifting snow, a small shape had stopped running and turned its head toward the scent of blood and smoke and man, imprinting something older than thought into memory. As the wind carried Caleb Mercer's trail deeper into the wilderness. The harbor town crouched against the frozen coastline like something built in defiance of the elements rather than comfort. A scatter of weather-beaten buildings clinging to rock and ice, while fishing vessels knocked hollow against their moorings under a sky the color of dull steel, and Caleb Mercer guided his snow-dusted truck down the single-plowed road with the calm detachment of a man who treated towns as temporary transactions rather than places. The bundled hides lay in the covered bed beneath a tarp weighted with rope, the scent faint but persistent. And when he stepped out into the cutting wind that carried salt and diesel and old fish, he did not look around as though searching for welcome, because he did not expect any. He simply adjusted his gloves and moved toward the back entrance of a supply warehouse, whose owner preferred cash and silence over paperwork and questions. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a tired yellow glare, and the air smelled of oil, damp wood, and thawing nets hung along one wall, while the owner, a thick-shouldered man named Brody, with a permanent crease between his eyes, glanced up from a ledger without surprise, as if men like Caleb emerged from storms as predictably as tides. No greetings were exchanged beyond a curt nod, and together they hauled the hides onto a steel table where Caleb unwrapped them with precise movements, revealing the rich brown fur of the sow and the smaller pelt of the cub, both carefully preserved, both heavy with value. Brody ran rough hands along the grain, checking for bullet damage, nodding once in approval, and muttered a number that hung in the air like a measurement rather than an offer. And Caleb considered it only long enough to ensure it aligned with his expectations before agreeing, because bargaining implied emotion, and he dealt in margins. While Brody counted bills from a metal cash box, the warehouse door creaked open again under a gust of wind, and a figure stepped inside without haste, closing the door behind him with deliberate care, as if sealing something more than warmth out of the room. The man was old, his face carved by years of cold and salt and endurance, dark eyes steady beneath a fur-lined hood, movements economical and quiet, and he carried no visible weapon, yet projected the kind of presence that did not require one. Caleb noticed him without turning his head fully, the way one registers a shift in terrain. And Brody stiffened almost imperceptibly before forcing his attention back to the money. But the old man's gaze remained on the hides spread across the steel table, particularly on the larger one. And he approached not with accusation, but with something closer to recognition. For several seconds he said nothing, the silence stretching until even the hum of the lights seemed intrusive. And then, in a voice that was low and unhurried, he spoke words that did not rise in volume, yet settled heavily in the space between them, saying that a mother leaves a mark when she falls, that the land carries it longer than men do. And though his accent bent the syllables slightly, his meaning was clear. Caleb finally turned to face him fully, expression unreadable, and asked if he was there to buy fish or preach, his tone level, almost bored, but the old man did not react to the edge in it. He only studied Caleb's face as if measuring something invisible, then shifted his eyes briefly to the cub's hide and back again. He said that killing for hunger was one thing, killing for trade another, and that the forest did not forget the difference, that what was taken without need walked in memory until balance was restored. And though the word spirit hovered in the implication, he never used it directly, instead framing it as something practical, almost inevitable. Brody cleared his throat, uneasy, and pushed the counted cash toward Caleb, as if eager to end the exchange. But Caleb did not look away from the old man, did not step back, instead allowing a thin, humorless smile to touch his mouth as he replied that the forest had no memory beyond tracks and wind, that animals followed instinct and men followed opportunity, and that balance was a word invented by those who lacked the strength to impose their own. The old man's expression did not change at the challenge, and that lack of reaction unsettled the air more than anger would have, because there was no curse in his eyes, no raised voice, only a steady certainty, as he answered that some lessons did not arrive as warnings, but as encounters, that sometimes what survived learned, and that snow could hide many things but never erase a scent carried long enough. The word survived lingered like a dropped object between them, and Caleb felt the smallest flicker of irritation, not at the implication, but at the presumption, yet he refused to grant it weight, instead folding the cash into his jacket and rolling the remaining packaging with mechanical precision. He told the old man that if the forest wanted him, it knew where to find him, a statement meant as dismissal rather than invitation, and turned toward the door without waiting for a response, boots striking the concrete with steady rhythm. As he stepped back into the harbor wind, the sky had darkened further, low clouds pressing down on the water, where ice cracked softly against hulls, and for a moment he stood beside his truck, breathing in air sharp enough to sting his lungs, replaying the conversation, not because he believed in it, but because irritation sought repetition. Behind him, the warehouse door opened once more, and the old man emerged, not close enough to threaten, not far enough to be irrelevant. And in the same calm tone he spoke a final sentence that the wind carried clearly despite distance, saying that the land does not hunt men, but what walks upon it sometimes does. And then he turned toward the docks, disappearing between boats and shadows without looking back. Caleb watched him go for only a heartbeat before climbing into the truck, telling himself that towns were full of men who survived by attaching myth to weather, that warnings were a form of currency here just as much as hides. And as the engine roared to life and tires ground against packed snow, he dismissed the encounter as background noise, unaware that somewhere miles inland beyond the thin reach of harbor lights, a young bear moved through trees with growing strength, following faint threads of scent carried stubbornly across frozen ground, learning slowly, patiently, the direction of the man who believed the forest remembered nothing at all. Caleb left the harbor before full dark settled, tires carving twin lines through wind-driven snow as the last lights of the town dissolved behind him, replaced by the vast, indifferent stretch of white and black that defined his real world. And with every mile the hum of civilization thinned, until only the engine and the muted roar of the wind remained. He preferred this transition, the gradual erasure of human presence, because towns required posture, while the wilderness required only competence, and competence was something he trusted. The road narrowed into a rough track, then into little more than memory between trees, and eventually he abandoned the truck at a concealed turnout known only to him, transferring supplies onto a sled he could drag the remaining distance to his cabin, moving with economical efficiency despite the deepening cold that stiffened fabric and tightened muscle. The sky had cleared enough for weak stars to pierce through, and the temperature dropped sharply, the kind of cold that crystallized breath midair and amplified every sound into brittle clarity, so that the scrape of runners against packed snow seemed louder than it should have. And more than once Caleb paused to listen, not out of fear, but habit, scanning the tree line where spruce stood like silent sentries. Nothing moved beyond drifting powder and the occasional groan of wood contracting under frost. And yet the memory of the old man's voice lingered in a way Caleb found mildly irritating, as if a splinter of conversation had lodged somewhere behind thought, repeating phrases about memory and balance that he dismissed each time they surfaced, reminding himself that animals followed scent and hunger, not prophecy. His cabin emerged from darkness as a low, angular shape half buried against a slope, built years ago from timber. He had cut himself, reinforced, insulated, practical rather than aesthetic, positioned to face a clearing that allowed early detection of anything approaching. And as he hauled the sled toward it, he conducted the same visual sweep. He performed every return, checking for disturbed snow, broken branches, altered patterns that did not belong. At first glance, everything appeared undisturbed, the drifted surface smooth except for his previous tracks partially filled by wind, and he felt the familiar quiet satisfaction of control restored. Inside, the cabin held the faint scent of wood smoke and oil, a narrow space dominated by a cast-iron stove, a heavy table scarred by knives, shelves stacked with ammunition and preserved food, maps pinned to one wall marked with coordinates and routes, and a rifle rack positioned within arm's reach of the sleeping cot. Caleb secured the door, lit the stove, and moved through routine with methodical calm, melting snow for water, preparing a simple meal, checking equipment for wear, hands steady and precise. Outside, the wind shifted direction, sliding along the cabin's exterior in low, restless sighs, occasionally rattling the shutters he had installed more for insulation than defense. And though he registered the change subconsciously, he did not assign it meaning. Hours passed with the steady rhythm of survival tasks, until fatigue settled into muscle, and he finally extinguished the main lamp, leaving only a dim glow from embers within the stove that cast elongated shadows against the wooden walls. Sleep in such places was never complete surrender, but layered awareness. And sometime deep into the night, Caleb's eyes opened without conscious trigger, body alert, before thought formed, because something in the pattern of sound had altered. The wind still moved, but beneath it lay another texture, faint yet distinct, a compression of snow somewhere beyond the wall facing the clearing. He remained motionless on the cot, listening with the stillness of someone trained to distinguish signal from noise, counting seconds between subtle shifts, measuring weight through resonance, and there it was again. A slow, deliberate crunch followed by silence. Not the erratic scurry of a fox or the light bounding of a hare, but heavier, spaced, patient. Caleb swung his legs to the floor without haste, reaching for the rifle with practiced smoothness, moving toward the narrow window beside the door, careful not to silhouette himself against interior glow. He lifted a corner of the covering just enough to peer through, breath controlled to prevent fogging the glass. And at first he saw nothing beyond the pale wash of moonlight over snow, the clearing still and wide and deceptively empty. Then his gaze lowered to ground level, and he noticed an indentation near the tree line that had not been there before, a depression broader than his outstretched hand, edges crisp in fresh powder, and a second impression several feet beyond it, aligned in a straight, measured path. His mind processed size before emotion could intervene, calculating stride length, depth relative to temperature, estimating weight. And though he did not allow fear to surface, he felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with cold. He watched for movement, but the forest offered none, only the static vertical lines of trees and the slow drift of loose snow crossing tracks that were already beginning to soften at their edges. After several minutes with no further sound, he stepped outside, rifle ready, boots sinking into the surface as he approached the nearest print, crouching to examine it under pale light, gloved fingers hovering just above without touching. The track was large, larger than any he had seen in this immediate area in recent years, the claws leaving clear arcs at the front of each toe, the pad deep and heavy, and the stride suggested controlled pace rather than charge. He straightened slowly, scanning the perimeter, senses sharpened, and for a fleeting instant, he had the sensation of being observed from beyond the reach of moonlight, not with malice but with assessment. He dismissed the thought as projection, a byproduct of isolation and the lingering echo of a harbor conversation he refused to dignify. Yet he could not ignore the evidence pressed into snow at his feet. The bear had approached the cabin, circled just far enough to study, and withdrawn toward the trees without testing door or wall. Caleb tracked the prints to the edge of the clearing, where they merged into shadow, pausing at the final visible mark before darkness swallowed the path entirely. And though he told himself that large males roamed wide territories and curiosity explained proximity, a quiet recognition settled beneath logic that this was no random crossing. When he returned inside and secured the door once more, he added fresh wood to the stove and remained seated at the table longer than usual, rifle laid across his lap, listening to wind reclaim the night, aware now that the forest had shifted from background to presence, and somewhere beyond the trees, hidden within layered black and silver, a massive shape stood motionless for several minutes more, committing the outline of the cabin, the scent of smoke, and the rhythm of the man inside to memory, before turning away into the endless white. Morning came without warmth, a pale, diluted light spreading slowly over the clearing, as if reluctant to touch what the night had measured. And Caleb Mercer stepped outside before the sun fully crested the tree line, rifle slung but ready, breath rolling in dense clouds that drifted and dissolved into the brittle air. The temperature had dropped further, sealing the surface of the snow into a thin crust that preserved every disturbance with ruthless clarity, and the tracks from the night before remained visible, despite wind, wide and deliberate, circling his cabin at a distance that suggested calculation rather than accident. He followed them again, this time tracing their full arc around the clearing, noting how the animal had remained just beyond effective rifle range from any window angle, how it had paused at 2 vantage points where sight lines converged, and how the stride never shortened into a charge nor scattered into retreat. This was reconnaissance, and the realization irritated him more than it unsettled him because it implied pattern. He moved toward the tree line where the prints vanished into shadow, and found broken frost clinging to low branches at shoulder height, fur caught in bark, thick, coarse strands that confirmed size and species, and he pocketed a few without conscious thought, proof to be examined later, though he already knew what they belonged to. Back at the cabin, he checked his traps along the outer perimeter, a habit as routine as breathing, and at the second snare he discovered twisted cable half buried in snow, the anchor stake torn loose and the bait missing, not cleanly eaten, but dragged away with deliberate force, leaving a disturbed channel that cut diagonally into forest. He crouched to inspect the damage and found claw marks not frantic, but precise, as if the animal had tested the mechanism before committing strength. And beneath irritation, something colder stirred, a recognition that this bear did not behave like a creature stumbling into steel by mistake. Caleb reset the trap with reinforced anchoring, adjusting tension and position, calculating angles of approach, transforming the perimeter into a more intentional barrier. And as he worked, he became acutely aware of silence, the kind that feels layered rather than empty. No birds broke the stillness, no small mammals skittered between trunks, and even the wind seemed to move at a cautious distance from the clearing. By midday, clouds thickened again, rolling low and heavy, promising another front of snow by evening. And Caleb used the hours of dim light to fortify what he had previously considered sufficient, stacking additional wood closer to the door, checking shutters for weakness, loading magazines, not because he anticipated immediate assault, but because preparation was the currency of survival. Yet beneath every motion ran a thread of something he refused to name, a faint echo of the old man's voice threading through memory, with irritating persistence, repeating that what survived learned, and he pushed the thought aside by focusing on measurable realities. Weight, distance, wind speed, ammunition count. Late afternoon brought the first flakes, sparse and dry, drifting down without commitment, and Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing once more, scanning the tree line through binoculars, methodically sweeping left to right, pausing at intervals where shadow pooled thicker. Nothing moved. but the absence itself felt intentional. And when he lowered the lenses, he saw new impressions at the far boundary, where snow had already begun to settle over older tracks, fresh prints overlapping the path from the night before. The bear had returned in daylight, not to attack, but to observe. Caleb felt the slow tightening of a contest forming, a shift from territory shared to territory contested, and for the first time since the initial gunshot days earlier, he replayed the moment of the cub fleeing into brush, calculating growth rates, seasonal survival odds, memory retention. He dismissed coincidence as unlikely, yet still resisted the narrative forming at the edge of logic, because to attribute purpose beyond instinct granted the animal a kind of agency he was reluctant to concede. As snowfall thickened, softening outlines and muting contrast, he retreated into the cabin and secured the door with deliberate finality, the world outside fading into white haze that swallowed depth and direction. Twilight blurred into night seamlessly under the storm's steady descent, and the wind returned with low, persistent force, pushing snow against walls in slow, accumulating waves. Inside, lamplight cast steady gold across timber as Caleb sat at the table, rifle cleaned and reassembled with meticulous care, movements repetitive and calming, yet every few minutes his gaze lifted toward the window despite himself. Hours passed without incident until a heavy thud struck the outer wall near the rear corner of the cabin. Not violent enough to splinter wood, but solid enough to vibrate through structure. And Caleb rose instantly, heart rate accelerating with focused clarity rather than panic, stepping toward the sound with weapon raised. Another impact followed, lower this time, accompanied by the unmistakable scrape of claws testing resistance. Snow muffled the world beyond, but the proximity was undeniable. Caleb positioned himself beside the doorframe and waited, listening to the bear's breathing through timber, slow and measured, not enraged, but present. For several seconds, both remained still, separated by inches of wood and an understanding neither would articulate. Then the pressure eased, footsteps crunching away from the wall in a calm retreat that felt more deliberate than any charge would have. Caleb moved to the window and peeled back the covering just enough to glimpse a massive silhouette dissolving into blowing snow, shoulders broad, head low, disappearing not in flight, but in control. The storm intensified, quickly obscuring tracks and edges, erasing clear lines between ground and air, and Caleb stood there longer than necessary, aware now that the boundary between hunter and hunted had shifted in ways not defined by bullets. When he finally stepped back from the glass, he understood something with quiet certainty. This was no random predator drawn by scent alone. It had measured him, circled him, tested him, and withdrawn with patience. Outside, beyond the curtain of falling snow, the bear moved through white darkness toward deeper forest, not finished but beginning. And as night sealed the clearing under relentless drift, the first chapter of a balance long set in motion settled into place.